welcome back to the channel. Well, you're riding with me in the F430. I seem to be on a run lately. I had the check engine light come up on the G for misfire, then the Mercy started to misfire, and now the F430 has started to misfire. It's just been one of those days. Well, here's the deal. The F430 misfires very, very light, which leads me to believe it's potentially the spark plugs. I'll tell you why. Not too long ago, I did a video on the 430, and when I was spinning, to keep the wheel speed up, to modulate it, I had to keep it almost on the limiter, and it induced like this rich condition. But using the Italian tune-up, it cleaned up. Unfortunately, this time it didn't work. So it seems that I need to investigate whether or not to do a plug change, and if the coils are okay. But my gut feeling is the coils are okay. So what I'm going to do is get the plugs coming. We'll jump in and do that. And I'll tell you something that the engine god, aka JC, my mentor, taught me. And that is when it's minor, there is a way to look for it before you go through the expense of the coils. If you think it's not in the coils and you just want to be sure, one way to do it is turn the lights out when it's dark, fire the car. If the coil case is giving way, you'll see an arc. And at night, it's plain as day. You'll see that flashing of light in the engine compartment. Now that's not 100% because this is coil unplugged, but most of the time when it's very minor, it's a crack. And that at least will give you some direction of what's going on. To test the coils, what I need to do is shut off all the shop lights, and then in the darkness, if there's a misfire, I should be able to see it. Actually, if you listen real close, you can hear it's misfiring right now. So if it is a coil problem, which I suspect it isn't, we'll see some light, like clear as day, for your own testing. But let's check it out and see what happens. I don't know about all of you, but I didn't see any light, so that's a good sign. At least puts me on the path that I should start with the plugs and then go from there. Now that that's eliminated, I'm gonna go ahead and take the gamble and do the job with just the plugs and see what happens. I've not changed the spark plugs on the F430 before, so you're riding along with me on the trial run, and let's hope I don't make too many mistakes. But looking in there, where I definitely want to start is pulling the Novatec carbon fiber engine panels, because you can see right here, with that frame rail in the way, there is no way to access those coils without the panels being removed. And even then, I'm not 100% sure, but I do know it's a good starting place. I'll jump in and start pulling the panels, and we'll go from there. The bottom two screws on the rear panel are 3mm and 3 4mm screws on top. I did the passenger side first because it has been a long time since I pulled those carbon engine bay panels. The driver's side has a few more obstacles in place, so I'll just go over that real quick. Pull. Now, what you have here is the emergency pull cable for the fuel door. Now, simply put, the easiest way is look very carefully, and there's a clip there, which you can use a pick to remove the clip. Be careful not to drop it, or it may go into no man's land. Then you can pull the handle off, push the cable through the trim piece, and it's free. Now, looking at the front, you have the two screws down below that you can use a 4mm Allen on. Up on top, there are two, but one is here. The other one is on this rubber bumper. I would just loosen that a bit, and let me show you why. Here's the panel right here. Now, if you look right there, you can see that it's got two notches. Those two notches are so you can loosen the screw, and this will slide out from under the bumper. I'll start on the passenger side, and we will use the rear cylinder because it is the easiest for me to film, and that way you can kind of see what's going on, even at that. It's not super great. But the first thing I'll say is, for those of you that are maybe just jumping into this, if you want to make it easier on yourself, remove the hardware without gloves. Gloves make it much harder, and I will tell you from experience, the last thing you want to do is drop any of those bolts or washers down, especially in cars that have under trays, because unless you're really lucky, you're gonna have to pull the under tray to get it. And again, I'm speaking just from a whole lot of experience. The bolts use a 5mm Allen. There's one up on top, and then the bottom one also holds a plastic retainer. So you want to make sure that you pull that out carefully. Set it aside. Then you can put a light twist and pull up on the coil. On a side note, if you do the job and all of a sudden you have some sort of weird radio whine after you've changed your spark plugs or changed your coils, there is a high probability that you damage the coil-on portion that goes above the plug. So just something to keep in mind. Now, once the coil is up, you can just kind of set it aside. Luckily, there's plenty of slack in the wire. And then you want to go down and pull the plug. Now, when you pull the plug, I will mention this. I use a snap-on magnetic spark plug socket. It is well worth the money. I don't know what it cost me, but it's worth 10 times that value. For those of you that do a lot of plug work and don't have one, I highly recommend it. It is the way to go. Now that I have the plug out, I can take a good look at what was going on. And from the factory, the F430 runs an NGK Platinum plug. The plug actually looks pretty good, but for 7,000 miles, you can definitely see that it was on the rich side. I don't see any speckling down in the valley of the porcelain, which would indicate detonation, which is a good thing. And then looking at the threads, the heat range looks right. And the true test will be, once I get more of the plugs out, comparing them. If everything looks uniform, there's a good chance that I was just having a rich condition. Now, as far as choosing plugs to go back into this F430, I would rather use Iridium. So what I did was I sourced Denso Iridiums. This is what I found in all the information that would cross. And I have confidence in Denso Iridium plugs because that is what I only ran in the X. And I can't recall ever having a problem with them. For those of you that don't know, there are quite a few benefits to running the Iridium plug. They run hotter, you can run more gap. They also are easier on the system, easier on the coils because they have less resistance than a Platinum plug. And they're supposed to last a lot longer. But in cars like this, and race cars that run really rich, I'm sure they last longer, but probably not as long as all of us would like them to last. But I did notice something that was a little alarming. When I pulled the plug and compared it to the Denso plug, take a look at this. The bodies do look similar. The thread length, pitch, everything is identical. But look at the height of the electrode. It's vastly different in the Denso plug. Now, to my knowledge, when the electrode's deeper, that's a colder plug. But I triple checked and the cross is right. So we'll just have to fire and see. The only thing that I can think of is potentially because of the increased spark and the gap. Now, as far as the plug goes, there's always a debate on antices. I will run a little bit of copper antices. I've never had a problem. Now, of course, what you'll read is that it affects the grounding of the plug. If you just use a little bit, I haven't seen it. It does affect the torque. There's no question that is correct. For all of you that don't know, when you run antices, you have to run less torque on the plug because there's less resistance as you're coming down. It does affect the torque rate. But you just compensate for that. I learned something in the race cars that I'll pass on to all of you. When you get a new plug, always check that the tip is tight. Every one of these came loose. So put a wrench on here on the body and then use a pair of pliers to tighten them down. If you miss that, you could induce a misfire. I checked the gap on the NGK plugs and they are 25 thou. I'm going to run the Denso at 34 thou. You must remember one thing though. When you're running more gap, you can get away with it with the Iridium plug. How much really depends on the strength of the ignition system. And any weak spots will typically show up, especially if you start getting crazy amounts of gap. But I feel that 34 thou will be good enough and run well. But then again, I could always be wrong. All right, everything is done on the passenger side. I've changed all 4 cylinders. Nothing major that was out of the ordinary. I will say that on any of these jobs, especially when they're high-end cars, it's always just a good idea not to be in a rush and have a lot of distractions. So, I will mention this. You want to be careful of this panel. It might not be an issue if you have a coupe, but at least on the Spider, you have to kind of lean across here, of course, unless you can figure out a different way than what I did it. And the front cylinder is way up there. It's even further up on that side, so I'm sure it's going to be a real treat. You can see the panel is fairly thin, and when I was leaning, I could feel it flexing. I think the last thing you would really want is to damage that, because I would be willing to bet that in Ferrari fashion, it is quite pricey. Now let's dive into the driver's side. One thing to keep in mind is when I did go to remove the plugs, they were really easy to pull. So when you send the new ones in, the torque spec is only 10 Newton meters, so it's not a lot there. But for me, once I can feel that the washer's seated, I usually just give it a quick tug to make sure that it's seated well. Don't be in a rush. I'll point out the things that really made things a bit more difficult to me that will maybe help you. The first thing is, look at the clearance. There's less room on the driver's side to get your arm down there, so doing the work to get everything out is tighter. Not to mention that the coil in the front is further forward on this side. Alright, so the rear 2 coils, not too much of a problem. The front 2, definitely things are getting tight. Now, I'll say a few things that helped me out. First of all, the hardware, the bolts that hold down the coils look really nice, but they're stainless steel. The downside is a magnet will not work. And man, reaching under there, struggling, trying to get my arm in there to get it, I was deathly afraid I was going to drop something. So there were 2 things that I found that assisted me that maybe will help you. The first is the claw. For those of you that don't know, that is a claw hand that comes out. You push the bottom button, it opens up. This allowed me to grab the hardware on the bottom side. On this side, everything's reversed. So the plastic lock is on the top side, and that bolt and washer just sitting down there waiting to fall. Then the next problem was getting it back in. It is a little bit tricky using this thing and getting it in right. What I did was I used a small piece of duct tape on the bolt head that held on to the washer. That way I was able to send everything in, and then I pulled the tape. That made it feasible to get the front one. I just couldn't do it by hand, magnet not being an option, and I was a little bit leery of using the claw. As I've always said, the spark plug is a key because it's actually in the cylinder. Once all the plugs are out, it's the best time to diagnose what in the world is going on. Well, I'm happy to report if you take a close look at these plugs, the things I'm looking for mostly is an even burn across the board, meaning that all of them have the same color in the porcelain and they have the same heat coming up the threads. That way it's a good measuring stick of what's going on. These all are a little rich, but they look very uniform, and that's a good sign. After all that, it's time to see if she fires, and if a misfire is present. I left all the carbon engine bay panels out. I would advise you do the same. The reason why is, make sure it fires and runs right. Otherwise, if you have to go back in, it's just going to be more work. Well, as all of you can hear, good times. The F430 is up and running. I don't hear a hint of a misfire. I will say that the exhaust tone does seem a little bit different, but most likely it's probably just up here. But it definitely did light off a lot easier, so maybe those Iridium plugs are doing the trick. Of course, I won't know for sure unless I take it out on the road, but at least for now, everything sounds good, and I'm glad that I don't have a misfire. I'm getting ready to send in the carbon fiber engine bay panels, and as all you can imagine, they are quite grimy, so I'm going to share a Drew tip with you. To clean up carbon, the thing that I found that is the best, or I should say the thing that Drew found that is the best, is actually Pledge. I'm not supported by Pledge in any way, but it's affordable and it does the best job of making the carbon look really good. Since I'm in here anyway, I'm going to take the time to go ahead and grease up the mechanisms for the convertible top, and of course that would only apply to you if you have a Spider. And then down below here is the F1 reservoir. I figure I might as well change the oil in the reservoir since I'm here as well. All right, good times. Everything is back together. You can take a look at it here and see what you think. A couple things I'll mention. You all know the F430 vibrates quite a bit, as with any Ferrari. So it's a good idea to use blue Loctite on the fasteners, especially if your engine bay panels are carbon fiber. That way you don't have to cinch down so hard that they start to splinter, which is heartbreaking. Or the fastener falls out, which has happened to me quite often as well. But that helps you out as just some insurance. Now, these panels were pretty expensive, and I try my best not to mess them up coming in and out, but you know my feeling on that, whether it be engine panels or interior panels, something always goes wrong. Case in point being, this panel right here, even though I was being careful, I picked up a scratch. The scratch is pretty hard to see, but it does just drive me nuts knowing it's there. I will show you something as a trick to kind of mask things if you are as unfortunate as I am. This, my friends, is a China marker, and it doesn't cost very much. You would be amazed at the things you can mask. On my car's carbon, on the engine bay, even on the exterior, from rock chips, a little bit of this, and just wipe enough of the material off so it's not noticeable, and it really, really hides those white scratches you could see that come into the clear of the carbon. I just love rolling in the F430, especially with the top down. As you can probably hear, everything sounds rock solid. I don't hear a miss at all. So we probably need to do is find a stretch of road where I can lean into it a bit just to make sure, but it definitely is running differently. So all I can say is that I'm quite happy with the Denso Iridium plugs. The cost was minimal, and for those of you that are thinking about trying them, they seem to be well worth it. But I don't know if you can take my word for it because I just put them in. Okay, here we go. I can tell you from first-hand experience, that sounds very good. Music to my ears. Well, I've been cruising the F430 for around 30 minutes now. It hasn't skipped a beat. So in my opinion, everything is locked down. I'm gonna go ahead and enjoy the rest of my ride in the F430. I hope all of you have a great weekend. Let's go, out that way. Good. Back the other way. Come on. Good. Another way. Good. Keep turning. Do not stop turning. That's not a turn. Turn back to Dad. Come on. Good. Good job. Here you go. Keep going. Don't worry about that.